Mr. Stephen Lewis. Stephen Lewis is a humanitarian who has long worked to improve the human condition, both here at home and abroad. Leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party for 8 years, and no, that's not the abroad part, during which time he became leader of the official opposition. He has served as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations and as the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF in New York. He's the former UN Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa, a post he held from June of 2001 to the end of 2006. In 2006, Stephen Lewis became the inaugural scholar in residence at the Institute of Globalization and the Human Condition at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Mr. Lewis is co-chair of the Leadership Program Committee for the 17th International AIDS Conference, which will be held in Mexico City in August of 2008. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. And Mr. Lewis is the chair of the board of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, which is dedicated to easing the pain of HIV/AIDS in Africa. Stephen Lewis is a companion of the Order of Canada, our country's highest honor for lifetime achievement, and he's not that old. In 2003, Maclean's magazine chose Mr. Lewis as their inaugural Canadian of the Year. In April 2005, Mr. Lewis was named by Time magazine of one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He holds 24 honorary degrees from Canadian universities. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and a senior fellow of Massey College. And finally, he is an author. Stephen Lewis's book, Race Against Time, was recognized last year by the Canadian Booksellers Association as the Book of the Year, and wouldn't you know, he was honored as the Author of the Year. Admired by Canadians of all political stripes, he has garnered respect and attention internationally for the strength and the eloquence with which he presents his convictions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you immensely, and thank you for so generous and friendly and gently hyperbolic an introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I am especially pleased to have had the privilege of hearing Dr. David Goldbloom. I was entirely fascinated by that talk and learned a great deal. One of the things I learned is the adroit skill of the psychiatric temperament, because having expressed his anxiety about being given the title psychosociophobia, or whatever it is, I noticed that the word did not then cross his lips for the rest of the speech. And it occurred to me that that was a most appropriate intellectual finesse. I, like David, am indebted to Coast and to Stenberg College for this invitation. And many things were triggered in my mind as Professor Goldbloom spoke. I've spent the last 5.5 years dealing with stigma, watching people living with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, struggling with stigma every hour of the day, and it remains one of the most appalling dimensions of the pandemic, and the blame to which Professor Goldbloom referred, which is applied to people with the virus, particularly because it is sexually contracted and therefore they are blamed for misdeeds, is something that deeply frustrates our capacity to respond. And one of the insights which he shared with you struck me as I listened to be particularly apt, because the one occasion in Africa where I have seen stigma largely removed was in the presence of a particular treatment facility run by Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, in a little northern community called Arua in the country of Uganda, where after 2 years of intensive treatment of those who were living with the virus and required treatment, and a tremendous campaign to get people tested so that they knew their status, whether they were HIV positive or HIV negative, and an equally intensive effort to spread the message of prevention throughout the community, When the community came together on the second anniversary of the arrival of Doctors Without Borders, the celebratory spirit was overwhelming, and the sense in the community of release from stigma, the sense that everyone knew where everyone else stood and no one was attributing blame, and there was a tremendous measure of mutual solidarity as I have seen nowhere else, demonstrated to me that intense human contact to which Professor Goldblum made reference is, of course, what does ultimately overcome the stigma in society which so deeply prejudices the issue of mental illness and which prejudices all such related matters. I was equally fascinated by his description of the responses of the 52 boys and 52 girls to the otherwise neutral pictures, except for the way in which they were labeled. And I wondered, when I'm finished, Professor Goldblum, whether you'll be able to distinguish for me how the boys answered and how the girls answered. Because if in fact acculturation was, as we would assume in the earliest years, allowing boys to be deeply aggressive, then their responses were probably somewhat different. I also got a kick out of the reference to Richard Nixon. I haven't heard Richard Nixon's name for a very long time. It plumbed the depths not of nostalgia, but of inching into my dotage. And I reflected on a particular anecdote which I would like to share with you. When I was Canada's representative at the United Nations, when I was a mock diplomat, a pretend diplomat, one of the things we did on a regular occasion was to say goodbye to our colleagues who were leaving the office. And a fellow named Joseph Verner Reed, who was then the third ambassador for the United States to the United Nations. The United States, believe it or not, has 5 ambassadors to the United Nations at any given moment, although only one of them achieves a certain notoriety. Joseph, who was number 3, was leaving the United Nations, and I was invited to a privileged luncheon to say goodbye. The luncheon was held at the home of the senior ambassador to the UN from the United States, a man named General Vernon Walters. And he occupied the residence of the United States, which is at the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria Towers, a marginally resplendent environment. And I went up the elevator of the Waldorf Astoria Towers, and it opened up onto only one apartment at the top floor. And the door swung open, and there was General Vernon Walters right in front of me. And he said, quote, "Oh, Mr. Ambassador, meet the President." And standing in front of me, hand outstretched, beady eyes fixed on my persona, was Richard Nixon. I knew at that precise moment in time that it was my hand or my marriage. I gave Richard Nixon the limpest handshake he has ever received in his entire infamous political career. And I then begged everyone not to tell my wife about it. And finally, I smiled when Professor Goldblum made reference to the fact of being in hospitals and people asking, how do you tell the doctors from the patients? And I was reminded, this is a true story, of campaigning with Tommy Douglas in Saskatchewan in the 1956 election. He was representing the riding of Weyburn, which at the time had what was called then the Weyburn Psychiatric Hospital. And I was campaigning in the hospital with Tommy as he went genially through the corridors, shaking hands with everyone he could find and who presented themselves. And he went up to one fellow and he put out his hand and he said, "Hello, I'm Tommy Douglas, Premier of Saskatchewan." And the fellow looked at him and said, "How glad to meet you. I'm Napoleon Bonaparte." And